Hi everyone and welcome along. We today are going to celebrate the lovely weather we've been having recently and paint a gorgeous, iconic red barn in a field. So grab your paints and let's get started. Come on Crumble, let's go. So we're going to begin with some drawing. I've got a 6x8" piece of paper here and I'm going to just sort of cut across the piece with a bit of a curving line, and then I'm going to get a straight edge in and do 2 vertical lines, maybe just about 1 inch and a bit apart, trying to keep them level at least at the top. And then what I'm going to do is do 2 diagonal lines tapering in like that, angling in. My sort of central point where we're going to meet up in the middle, and then I'm going to do another vertical just a tiny bit lower than that first one, and then I'm going to start joining up the lines. This one I'm going to keep a little bit more level, so by doing that angled a tiny bit and that more level, it starts to give us this slight sense of perspective. And again, I'm going to sort of get it by eye. So this will also just angle down a fraction. And that one there as well. So you can see we've got this barn taking shape, but it's just sitting nicely in the landscape and looking like it's part of it, so it's sort of going off into the distance. Right, we'll put a little bit of detail in. So get some lines going. We could mask all this off in masking fluid, but I'm feeling up to the challenge of actually just being a bit careful with my brush. I'm taking inspiration from a reference photo, and this kind of barn is not so familiar to me in the UK, but they're really beautiful and iconic red barns. I wish some of our barns looked like this. That would be kind of cool. And I just find it really interesting how different cultures and countries end up designing sort of functional structures in such different ways. So I'm just putting 2 sort of window frame shapes, and then up at the top here I've got a bit of a design going on. I'd love to hear from you if you have one of these on your land, or if you live near one, and I'd love to know the function of the various design features on this barn. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave these little bits unpainted, leave these white, so we'll be painting around the edge of them. A bit of a crisscross, and then there's 2 little white rectangles either side. Some little white rectangles. Getting a little bit smaller as they go off into the distance, and that is pretty good. So all that's left to do is just sort of even up the front there and we can get painting. So I'm going to begin by putting in the sky and the ground. We're going to do a lovely big blue wash of a sky, so I'm going to begin by placing in a wash of colour with my mop brush. I'm just doing the sky, but you can see also that I'm sort of very carefully going around the edge of this barn because I don't want to get it wet. You could use a smaller brush, but I'm just really aware there's some very noisy sparrows outside my window making all sorts of a racket. I think they're having some kind of disagreement. So if you can hear some sort of rather high-pitched squealing, that is the wildlife in the garden. Right, I'm just using a smaller brush to get right in there. I think I had a tiny bit of colour on it, doesn't matter. Okay, so I'm going to use my large size 12 connoisseur brush with a bit of cobalt blue deep and a bit of Winsor blue. It's a lovely turquoisey colour. And I think we're just going to swoosh some colour across. I love keeping a nice raw edge on the edge of the page. I'm not going to be neatening it up at any point. And if you want a little bit of extra control with the brush, you can always get something smaller. It's a warm day here today, and it's amazing how the page is already drying. Oh, there we go. Still nice and wet on this side. So I like to sort of take advantage of the unpainted space in the sky there to create some nice sort of hazy clouds. It's just important to try not to let your colours pool and puddle on the page, because it will warp the paper a little bit if you haven't got it masked, taped down, or using it from a block, because I'm using a loose bit of paper. Now I will just drop in a few more sweeps of cobalt blue deep just to make the sky just that little bit more interesting. And as well as leaving space unpainted for clouds, you can also sort of drop in deeper colour like this to help with the contrast of the lighter parts of the sky. Okay, we need this to dry 100% before we place in anything else, but whilst we're waiting for that to dry, I'll just talk you through the colours for the field. So we've got green, gold and cadmium yellow. They're going to be our key colours, and then we'll be bringing in a little bit of sap green and deep sap green for a few little low light details. Right, I'm going to start painting in onto a dry page. Just to begin with, I want to get the control and I want to start building the colour up. So I'm starting with cadmium yellow, quite wet, with a size 8 brush, and just getting in around the barn there. You could have wet your page again, but I just quite like to show sort of some differing options. And I'm going to sort of come down again. So getting a sort of wet amount of colour, and then I can spread it further by just dipping my brush in and making sure that I'm not putting like a sopping wet brush of puddling colour on the page, but I'm just helping stretch the colour down. I think it's just because I want a bit more control with it, and I'm going to start and sort of also using my brush strokes to sort of curve a little bit, because I'm going to begin to bring in some other tones. So I've got green gold here that I'm going to start to introduce around the base of the barn. And so just starting to sort of build up that sense of the direction of the farming, and I'm going to bring in, I'm actually going to bring in a little bit of yellow ochre. I didn't mention that as a colour earlier. I hadn't woken it up, but I'm going to just introduce a little bit of that around the edge of the barn. Doesn't matter if you get a little bit over the top of the barn, because this is the kind of colour that will help us sort of create that like rough feel around the edge of it. And just bringing a little bit of that into there. And that's all slowly drying, and really that's why I wanted to place the paint onto a dry page, because I wanted to have a slightly faster drying time that allows me to work into the piece a little bit more swiftly. So we talked about the other colours, the sap green and deep sap green. It's not a huge amount of difference between the two, but there is a little, and it's just always useful to have more colours at your disposal. Of course, if you don't have deep sap green, you can always mix in Payne's grey to sap green and you'll be there pretty much exactly. So with my size 2 brush now, and I'm going to just take most of the paint off the brush because I want to do this sort of gently, is I'm just going to start dabbing the brush into the field, and I want to start getting this feel of the curve of the crops, maybe starting to feel like we're just seeing it, where the way it sort of turns the corner here. So the page is drying for sure, but it's still a little bit wet, so we're still getting just a slight feathering. And you can see if it does start to sort of dry too much, you could always add a slightly wet brush and just go back in and work into it a little. I think a size 2 brush is a good choice because it's large enough to carry quite a lot of paint on it, so you can sort of continue working into the field without having to go back into the palette too frequently. That's rather nice, pleased with that. So I'm going to let that dry a little. I might pop a bit more yellow ochre just into the area immediately around the barn. There we go, and we'll let that dry 100% and we'll start on the barn, and we're going to use some cadmium red and a little bit of alizarin crimson as well, so get those two ready to go. I've got a size 0 brush for the next bit, so I've woke up the cadmium red and alizarin crimson as said a little earlier, and I'm just going to tilt the page a little bit because I'm going to start painting in the colour. But what I want to do is to paint it in, and in painting in the strokes in the same direction of the horizontal planks, while I'm not looking for a whole ton of really obvious crisp planks and things, just by angling my brush strokes in the same direction, we're going to get a feel that they are faint horizontal planks. It's a bit like how we paint feathers in on birds. We're not painting every single one in great detail, but just by sort of setting your intention to paint them in the same way, it's going to really help the look of the piece, rather than just sort of going, all right, this is red, I'm just going to colour it in. Be a little bit more mindful about ways in which you can help yourself create a really lovely and more realistic painting. We're not really in the business of painting photorealism on this channel. In fact, we're definitely not, because I can't do that. But I like to capture the essence of a piece, and so in doing it like this, we sort of find little ways to get there. It's almost like a little cheat, but I don't really think it's cheating. It's just a watercolour technique, isn't it? So we're going to paint this in, and then we will continue over to the front of the barn and do the same thing. And of course that is going to require a little bit more dexterity with the brush to get around the edge of some of these unpainted little white bits. So keep that in mind while you're painting. I'm still just using the cadmium red at this point. Here we go. So if there's something horizontal there that you can follow the line of to sort of establish your horizontal lines, and that's brilliant. I do find it's much easier though if you are painting horizontal lines and you want a little sense of that unpainted gap in between, to start at the top and work your way downwards. It's much easier to get that little gap, you can see, like that. So I've not taken my own advice, and I've started halfway down the building, but I will later on get right up there and work my way downwards. So for these last fiddly little bits, it's up to you whether you want to try and achieve the horizontal planking in these little gaps, or if it's just fine to just place them in just as little blocks of colour. Now, I haven't actually used any other colour than the cadmium red at this point, but what I'm going to do is now use the alizarin crimson as a bit of a low light, and then what we're going to, we need to put in the roof, don't we? So a nice little grey silver metal roof. But yeah, so here's the alizarin crimson. So what I thought would be quite cool, like I said, is using it as a bit of a low light. The thing is, this barn is far away, so I don't want there to be a whole ton of detail on it. But you can see just adding in those little bits do just help it stand out just a little bit more. We'll also be glazing some shadow over the top of this, so that's also still to come. But there are also, if I look more closely to my my reference photo, I can actually see there are some doors just hidden in the red, just sort of underneath these windows, so I can place those in, and that's quite good. So for the roof, we want a grey metal. I mean, Payne's grey on its own is pretty good actually, so I think I'm just going to stick with Payne's grey, and I'm going to paint both sort of panels of the roof in the similar sort of quite dilute Payne's grey stripes with the size 0 brush. And you can see, just like we did with the planks on the barn, these are not all nice and crisp and even. They're bleeding into one another. They're uneven. This is all good. This all just helps with the sort of level of realism we're going for. And once we've done that and they're dry, we can start looking at some shadow. While I wait for the barn to just dry completely, I am taking some cadmium yellow and just adding a little bit more texture to the foreground of the field with my size 2 brush. To just help again bringing the field to life with a bit more detail in the foreground and less in the distance. And I said we were going to get the deep sap green into play, and that's what we're going to do now. So with the size 0 brush, just getting a few extra little low lights on the dry page. Yeah, just adding those in a little bit and then going up to the barn as well. And just sort of placing that in the field a little bit more as well. The final stage of this is the glazing of the shadow, and you have to make sure that your barn is nice and dry for this. And I've just mixed up, well, I've not even mixed up anything, I've just put in some Payne's Grey, nice and dilute, into my palette. And what I'm going to do is, this top edge of the barn is nicely baking in the sun, but this one here is just a little bit more in the shadow. So I'm going to place on the glaze of Payne's Grey there, but you can see I just did it so that it just sort of petered out towards the side and the base, because I felt like the sun would probably just catch a few little bits of that. And then for the barn itself, I'm going to paint in this side with a Payne's Grey glaze as well. And then I'm going to just do it just a little bit like that. And then also on the ground itself, and you see how that's a lot stronger, so I've chosen to do that so that then I can just sort of get in with the crops and really make an impact there. Now what I want to do is let this all dry, and then I want to add in just a few slightly stronger tiny weeny bits of shadow, and then we'll be done. And there you have the finished piece. So you can see how the glaze really just gives you that feeling of the shadow on the side, and I rubbed out the pencil as well, so the white really is starting to pop. Yeah, so this is a lovely simple landscape to try. We have loads more landscape tutorials in the landscape playlist on the channel. So make sure you're subscribed to the channel. It is free, and you can access hundreds of different watercolour tutorials for beginners through to more experienced painters. We've got everything there for you. And of course, if you want to join our Patreon, there are so many extra exclusive tutorials on there, but as well, you get a chance to have your say in requesting YouTube tutorial content. So that's rather exciting too. And this was, in fact, a request from a patron. So patrons, there you go. I hope you enjoyed it. And for everybody at home, I hope you're enjoying watercolour painting. It brings me so much joy, and I'm really excited that I get to spread the wonderful world of watercolour with you. Okay, until next time, bye!